So I'm going to walk you through everything that I've been doing so far, and I think probably in the next couple of days I will be able to get done all of the insulation. So of course you're going to get to see from the very beginning to the end everything that's been happening in this shed. Remember, this is a shed series I've been working on. You can find all the videos down below, the build, the electrical, and now the insulation. Today's video is being sponsored by Arrow Fastener in order to put up the 6mm plastic that has to go over top of this insulation. So I'm going to show you all of it. Oh, and hopefully warm up. My hands are so cold. Let's jump into this video right now. When you want to do the interior of your own shed, somebody should tell you, don't plan for this to take a little bit of time. Plan for a lot of time. And that's how long it's been taking me to get the electrical done. And this video, I'm going to show you everything that I did for the insulation, but I'm trying to do as much as I can for myself on the inside without taking the entire year. Insulation is something that I felt I could do on my own, and I'll tell you, I ran into some challenges, but overall it was a project that I think any DIYer can do. Just plan for more time. So here's the thing, when you are getting insulation, have this stuff delivered if you can. I was only able to fit maybe 4 of these big bats into my minivan, and paying for the delivery was just so worth it. So some of it was delivered, some of it I hauled home. And in terms of materials, I definitely went with the Rockwool. I mean, I know the pink stuff is out there, it's available, but this has such a good reputation. It's waterproof, fireproof, soundproof, everything that I wanted for my shed. It's also less itchy, apparently, although I was still a little itchy, and it's very dense. So it was not very difficult to put up, at least in the walls, and you'll see in just a moment. You'll also need a bread knife or an insulation knife. This is actually just pretty much the same thing, but you can buy it in the insulation aisle. You'll need a tape measure, some gloves, eye protection, a dust mask, and also, of course, you'll need a stapler. Now, I'm going to be using the T50 by Arrow Fastener, but I'm also using the PT50, which is a pneumatic stapler. I got the genius idea. Why am I not using my PT50 with my air compressor? So much easier, but both can be used depending on what you have. And you'll notice this insulation doesn't have a vapor barrier attached to it. So you'll need a roll of 6mm, or you can go with a little bit thicker plastic, but at least a minimum of 6mm plastic is good as a vapor barrier for the ceiling and the walls. And of course, that's when we need our stapler. So let's jump into how we did this exactly. And down below in the description, you can find all the timestamps if you want to jump around. Now, most studs are 16 inches on center, which means from the middle of one stud to the middle of the next stud, it's typically 16 inches, or let's say it should be. Well, my shed, even though it's prefabricated, that wasn't the case for every single bay. And there were some that were smaller just because of how the studs were placed. And in this corner, you can see there are a couple of them that are definitely not 16 inches on center. So I cut those to length and width, but I added a 1/2 inch to a 3/4 of an inch extra on those pieces. This insulation just really slides into place, and that little bit of extra width and length will help it to stay in there snug. Now, when you're putting this insulation in, you'll notice I've got through the double top plate some of the electrical cords coming through there, the wiring. So that is pretty easy to work around. I literally just opened up the center and fit it in between the insulation. So pretty simple. And here's a little tip. When you're insulating your shed and you've got some of these discarded pieces that you're cutting off from the other larger pieces, save those because they come in handy for any little places above the window, or like in this case, I had this real skinny part that I didn't want to waste an entire piece on a new piece of insulation. So these discarded parts come in handy. Now, it wasn't too difficult to insulate around the electrical boxes. I could use a tape measure, and for some of this I did, but there were times when I also just placed the piece right up against the box, literally marked it with the bread knife or the insulation knife, and then cut it out. And here you want to make sure that you know how far in to cut. I believe this box was maybe about 2.5 inches, but measure all your boxes just so that you know for sure. Now, here's the thing. How do you insulate around electrical wires? Well, the boxes are pretty simple and the wires are just as simple too. The thing is that you need to know how far down, how many inches you need to make that same measurement on the back of your insulation. You'll want to cut, but not all the way through, and create a slit. So when you go to put the insulation in, that slit gets buried in the insulation in that slit, because you don't want any of the insulation pushing on the electrical wiring. You don't want the wiring to be pushing on the insulation so that it doesn't fit properly. So make that slit, again, don't go all the way through, and just nudge it in place, and you should be good to go with having all your wiring in there. Now, those are pretty simple. I did run into a couple of cases where I'm like, how am I going to insulate around this? For example, the sub panel, there's a bunch of wiring coming from the sub panel. So I was not sure how I was going to insulate around that. So here what I did was I cut just a little sliver from the left and a sliver from the right. And then I kept those pieces and used those to put behind the wiring that's coming out of the sub panel. So once those were in place, the other piece literally just sort of fit on like, I don't know, like a top. I was pretty stoked that I was able to come up with a solution so that it fit perfectly without disrupting the wiring. And the other place that gave me a little bit of anxiety was over near the door. There was a lot of wires coming out of there where there were some light switches, and I did the same thing. And here, the only thing that I had to do differently was sort of mark with my finger where that light box was. And I just dug out and sort of created this circle so that when I put it back in place, hopefully it would be flat. So it did require me removing some of the insulation right where that light box was. But once I kind of figured out what I was doing, it wasn't so bad and it worked pretty well. So those are two strategies you can use if you're trying to fit your insulation around your light boxes, your electrical wiring. So the walls were pretty simple and I didn't have any problem with them. So the next part was moving on to the ceiling. But then I realized, wait a minute, we've got two very important things we have to do before we move on. So anyway, the next thing that has to happen is we have to take some measurements just to make sure everything is 24 inches on center, which I believe it is. And we also have to take some measurements on the windows because we have to frame out the skylights in order to even put the insulation up there. It needs something to grab onto because right now the area where it is, it's just kind of open. So there's nowhere to put the insulation around the window. So we have to fix that. I think we should probably be done this in the next couple of days, I think. I always underestimate how much time it takes. Oh my gosh, I'll think something's going to take 2 days and it takes 2 to 3 weeks. So anyway, if you have a shed that has skylights, you might have to do this because some of these sheds, they don't come with the framing needed to have drywall or insulation in place. And you need to figure out what shape of the window well, I should say. Is it called the window well? I don't know what it's called, but that area, what do you want it to look like? So I decided for this part that's closer to the wall, the lower part of the window, the skylight, I wanted this to be perpendicular to the floor. So those boards are going to come straight down. I did 2 boards and I wanted to make sure that they were also straight, that they were plumb. So I did use a framing square to check those because again, this is going to be drywalled and it has to be even for the drywall to even go on there properly and look good. And then for the upper part of the skylight, I decided those would be at right angles to the roof. And so this shape, I don't know what you call it, but it lets in the most maximum light, and that's what I wanted. The main thing I wanted to make sure is that when I was putting this up, I did not hit those wires. I should have technically have done this before all of the electrical went in. I did that myself. You can see the video up there in the corner, but I forgot to do it beforehand. And so I just had to be extra cautious. Now I used 4 2x4s and cut all the pieces to the same width, but I just made adjustments as needed based on the measurements. But overall, it looked pretty good. And you can see that on the top part of the skylight, it's coming down at a 90-degree angle from the roof, and the bottom part is coming straight down. So this lets in the maximum amount of light. Now, this is another problem. I needed to figure out ventilation, and you remember in the last video that I posted, you can see it up in the link there in the corner, I didn't know what kind of ventilation to do. So I decided to use these 2-inch soffit vents and just drilled with a 2-inch hole saw with my power drill here, and it worked fine. Oh, another thing, make sure those vents are pointing towards the wall. I also needed to drill some holes in order to let some of that ventilation in. This shed, as I mentioned in the other video, is a little different than a traditional house, so it wasn't the same, and I had to make some adjustments. So these are the baffles that I installed to allow that air that's supposed to come in with the 2-inch soffit vents to come up through the roof out the ridge vent. And these baffles prevent that insulation from blocking this airflow. And so I needed to staple these in place. And this is where the Aero Fastener T50 heavy duty stapler came in handy. I went through so many staples. I literally went through probably 2 boxes of staples. So if you're using the heavy duty, just handheld one, be sure to get lots of staples, but also the PT50, the pneumatic stapler. This works great as well, and it uses the same T50 staples. You will need a compressor, and this is one that I love. It's kind of quiet, just connects with a hose and a coupling. I'll leave the links down below and in the blog post, but if you're doing a big job, it actually helps to have the pneumatic one. For more information about the T50 or the PT50 pneumatic for your insulation project, be sure to go down below to the description or go to aerofastener.com. Once the baffles were in place, it was time to make sure that there's no gaps where there's air coming in where we didn't want it to come in. So this is where I used some 3-inch spray foam. I tried to plug up those gaps as much as possible. This stuff does expand to like a really big, thick, hard knot. So I did have to trim that down a little bit so that it was nice and flush with those trusses. So let's move on to the next part, the insulation in the ceiling. Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I really didn't think doing the insulation in the ceiling would be that difficult, but it is. And it's even more itchy doing it in the ceiling because as I'm trying to lift up these big R30 pieces of insulation, it's falling and crumbling down on me. So it's getting all over my neck. So today I came armed. I look like a ninja. I am ready today to do the insulation and to at least finish one side, but I thought this is perfect because it protects my neck, and with my glasses, this should protect my entire face. Well, it actually didn't. Somehow this insulation figures out how to get into your shirt. I don't know how. Baby powder apparently helps. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting a little piece of the insulation between the spray foam, and then you'll see the bottom of that insulation. It's a little sloped because I wanted to remove some of the bulk because that's where it's going to be sitting next to the spray foam, and you can tell it's pretty bulky in that area. So I probably should have removed a little bit more of that bulk just so I could get it in there easily. And you'll see in the next video with the drywall why that was so important to remove some of that bulk. So if you are doing your own insulation, be sure not to leave that part too bulky because it does make a difference in how well the drywall goes up. Now, I did see that there were people who have installed insulation like this by putting the plastic up first and then sliding everything in, but that wasn't going to work well for me. So I had used individual sheets, and that slowed me down until I got this great idea. I thought, why don't I just put up a small sheet of plastic to just hold it in place, just staple it in place, and then slide the bat in. And because I could still get access to where that insulation meets the baffle, I could still sort of maneuver it into place so that there was no gaps. And this worked perfectly well. So once I realized this was going to work for me to hold those bats in place, then I could move much faster. Now, they actually do make some metal rods that you can use to hold the insulation in the ceiling in place, but I found that they didn't work that well. I did use them occasionally, but what I found is that the pieces of plastic work better. These metal rods have a little point at the end of them that's supposed to grab into the trusses, but I found that those tend to fall out. So the pieces of plastic work much better. Now, moving on to the lighting, a couple of things here. I did have to insulate around the lighting. So if you're using recessed lights such as this, make sure that it's IC rated, which is insulation contact. You don't want anything to get too hot. You don't want your insulation to burn. But here we have a couple of things going on. You can use these types of lights. People say they're outdated, but personally, I figured since everything was open, it was easier to install these before the drywall goes up. But some people like to put the drywall up and then just cut out a hole and do just an LED insert. That's fine. You can do that as well. These lights will have LED inserts, but because I already had access to all the framing, I figured why not just use these? And that's why I made this decision. I did run out of insulation that was 24 inches wide, so I ended up piecemealing this together and using some that was made for 16-inch bays and just stack them up side by side. That was a little difficult because I had to squeeze them in there, and without enough staples in the plastic, it tended to fall down. So make sure that you're putting enough staples in the plastic to hold everything up. And remember the framing we did around the skylight? Well, you can see the insulation fits against it nicely, and you just want to make sure that you completely insulate that and cover that in plastic as well. Woo! All of the insulation has been put in, and now it's time to add plastic. I feel so accomplished. Now, the larger sheet of plastic is not that difficult to install because we're going to be pulling it all the way across all the insulation at once. So this is much easier. So making sure that there's an overlap between the one sheet of plastic and the other sheets, that's pretty important. So you'll see that I've got probably about 6 inches of an overlap there. And I'm pulling it tight, stapling it into place. You don't have to staple along every single truss or every single stud. I think I overstapled, but at least make sure that you staple where there's any sort of overlap between two pieces of plastic. And of course, make sure that you've got some vapor barrier over your skylights. And the vapor barrier is going to cover the windows, it's going to cover the receptacles. That's okay, because as it's going up, you can use your scissors and cut out the windows and the boxes and the switches and all that. And we're going to use something called tuck tape. Now, this is the red one. They actually make a blue one, and that's the one I would recommend because it's made specifically for vapor barriers. I've seen a lot of videos where they're using red, and it seems to work. So every single staple or every single place where there's an overlap, that's where you're going to use the tuck tape. So you don't want any gaps or any staples or holes in your 6mm vapor barrier. So once I was able to remove that, it was easy to fit the plastic around those workbenches. And, I just finished off whatever tuck tape I needed to around the windows and around the electrical boxes. You'll also notice that I put the tuck tape around the recessed lights and around the skylights. So anywhere there is staples or where the plastic could be exposed to moisture, that's where you put the tuck tape. And along the bottom, don't forget that as well. So if you remember, this is what my shed looked like before anything was done to it. I mean, there was no insulation, there was no electrical, and this is what it looked like when I was done. It was a lot of work, but guess what? The drywallers came. I decided that I was going to hire out the drywall because this has taken me so long and I just needed to make some progress and I really wanted a professional finish. So you got to come back for the next video because as I am recording this, the drywall is installed and you've got to come to the next video to see it. It looks fantastic. Be sure to check out all the videos in this shed series. You can find it down below. I'm Serena from Thrift Diving and I'll see you next video.